Here's a question for you. Do you own your name, or is it Crown copyright? The reason I ask is because I had an email from a lady called Lynn, and she said that she has renounced her name and returned her birth certificate and says, I want nothing more to do with this. I'm not using this name anymore because it's not actually mine. And that got me thinking. Now, we've often spoken about the name and what that means and the copy of a certified birth and all of those things and what that is when you've got capitalization of your name. We've explored many times that your name, when it comes on an envelope and it's all in caps, is not actually you, is it? Because you're not letters on a page, you're not hieroglyphics on an envelope, you're a living sentient being. I mean, when I think of myself and I think, actually, who am I? What am I? I'm not a name. That's just something to get my attention. Somebody says, oi, you. Oh yeah, I could be called that. Or I could be any name that I agree to be hailed by. And so, yes, I'm not a capitalization thing. What am I? I am some sort of sentient being with a consciousness, and that's it. And when I look at my body and I think, well, I think they kind of belong to me, but they are not me. So I am really, when it comes down to it, nothing physical at all. I seem to be something ethereal inside a flesh and blood body, and that's about it. And we often call that a living man or a living woman. But really and truly, I'm just a bundle of thoughts that perceive the world in a certain way. And I'm certainly not a name. And I'm certainly not a name that somebody else has decided to call me or indeed register. And I think this is the interesting thing. Now, Lynn said, of course, if you start using the name that's been registered, it means you've basically given it away to somebody else. It's now Crown copyright. And that's an interesting thought. And all the time we use the name that we're given by our parents and the ones that we've been registered, and we use our first name and our surname, which is Crown copyright, effectively we're remaining in that jurisdiction, and we ought to obey and abide by all those rules and regulations that they have made. So that if we want to come out of that jurisdiction, it seems to me that we have to decide upon our own name, maybe something completely different. You can call me Frank. No, I still like the name Richard. It's meant something, and actually it was something that my father and mother wanted to call me. But rather than using the actual name as given and taken and registered to the Crown copyright, perhaps now I should be something like Richard from Worthing, or Richard the YouTuber, or Richard of Biggleswick. And in fact, Richard of Biggleswick, which is my allegory town, a town in which the people in that town decided, you know, we're going to take back responsibility for ourselves. We're not going to be part of your jurisdiction with your legalese and your acts and statutes. We're not going to take your anti-human policies anymore. We're not going to be part of your voting process and putting back into Parliament the same old system as before. We're going to have an independent system that is actually locally based and resourcing things locally. We will have local farms, we will have local businesses, and we will oust all those big corporations which are there to cause us harm and treat us as slaves. And so that Biggleswick, actually, I think is it's a nice name. It's a made-up town. It's an idea. It's a proposition, if you like. And so, if I come from that proposition of something which has meaning to me, that's what I can be known as. So, when somebody says, "What is your name?" I can say, "Well, I am Richard from Biggleswick," and then I'm not using the Crown copyright. Now, be quite interested to know what would happen if you're stopped in your conveyance travelling along the roads of this country, of this land, and somebody says, right, what is your name? I need to see your driving licence. You say, well, actually, I've had to revoke this driving licence because it's not actually me. I mean, it's just a capitalised name. It's Crown copyright. I ought not be using it. It would be an offence to be using a false false name that is somebody else's name on a list that they've decided they wanted to keep. So I am known as Richard of Biggleswick. Now, I'm sure that would be very upsetting for the police, because they'd be a bit confused, and they may then go through some default procedure of saying, right, well, because you're not doing what we think you ought to be doing, we're going to impound this car and take you away and lock you up or force you to walk home on your own. However, if everybody started to think, actually, this name that I have been given and I'm using potentially illegally, because it's not really mine, it's been registered and therefore its ownership has been given away, maybe if everybody said, well, here you go, you can have your birth certificate back, I don't want no more to do with it, and actually I'm going to call themselves whatever they wish to call themselves, a completely different name, and then if everybody was doing that, of course, we'd all be outside the jurisdiction. The problem is, of course, that not everybody is going to do that, and most people, let's face it, are half asleep, don't know what's going on, and haven't even thought about it, and the very idea that their name is not their name is probably a challenge to them. Plus the fact then there is the ability to say, well, hold on a second, instead of that, maybe then Richard of Biggleswick could be, seeing as they've allowed me to use the name, then I shall be the executor of that estate. And that's very much how I approach things these days. I think of myself as the executor of this legal fiction. This legal fiction, yes, it isn't mine, but they kind of given me license to use it, because why else would they give me a birth certificate? Why else would I have to have a bank account in that name? And why else would I have a driving license and all the other bits and bobs in that name? Now, whilst that name isn't me, I'm acting a bit like an agent, really, an agent for this legal fiction. I can take advantage of this legal fiction's thing, because the poor old legal fiction can't do anything. It hasn't got any arms and legs. It can't walk about. It doesn't breathe. But all the time they've allowed me to have it, I will act as a remote individual, if you like, a remote man operating as an agent this legal fiction. But me, you could call me Richard of Biggleswick, who is the executor of the legal fiction Richard Vobes, or whatever. So maybe that's a way forward. But it was an interesting email that I got from Lynn, and I thank you for that, because it's given me a lot of thought about, should we be handing back our birth certificates and our licenses and saying, actually, to be completely out of your system, I'm not even going to use those things that you've given me, and I will be out. Be interesting to see what other people make of that.